Shuddering cold and clinging to the side of a mountain, your only chance for survival is to hold on. The driving wind and pelting snow open the door wide to begin to question, what on earth am I doing here? Couple that with the knowledge that you are on one of the most treacherous paths on this mountain, and that feeling begins to intensify. Avalanches and rock slides are common. There's no way to rappel, and the sheer section you are on offers no caves or divots to escape the storm. So you hang on, exposed, with lost gear, with a sick partner, clinging to the mountain and the idea that help will come. Welcome back to Tragedy with a View. I am your host, Kayla, and the next few episodes might sound a little weird because they're going to be solo episodes. My schedule just kind of fell apart, and I'm doing my best to get you these episodes consistently, and June just happens to be a really crazy month schedule-wise. So we're going to roll with it, and the exclusive episode will be available on the 7th. You can join us on Patreon or Apple Podcasts to listen to that. So, yeah, let's just jump right into this episode. You will see Mount Rainier as you fly in and out of Seattle, Washington, and it is a well-known landmark of the area. Mount Rainier stands 14,410 feet or 4,392 meters tall and is an active volcano. Mount Rainier has the most glacial coverage in the continental 48 states and is a huge source of life for the area. 5 major rivers begin on Mount Rainier. Wildflowers grow in the meadows on the mountains and in the lands surrounding the base, and the wildlife is plentiful. The national park contains lands that historically were home to Cowlitz, Muckleshot, Nisqually, Paliup, Squaxin Island, Yakima, and Coast Salish tribes. The national park today recognizes that the cultural history of the land is just as important as the geographical history, and the values of these tribes is what helped to shape the landscape and area into what we know and honor today. The name Rainier came from British Royal Navy Captain George Vancouver, who decided to name the mountain after his friend Rear Admiral Peter Rainier. George Vancouver named the mountain in 1792, and unfortunately, Peter was never able to see the mountain in person. General Hazard Stevens and Philemon Beecher Van Trump were the first recorded summits of Mount Rainier in 1870. In 1893, in order to protect the area from the timber industry, 35 miles or 56 kilometers to the east of Mount Rainier, with the summit on the western edge of that declared area, was formed into the Pacific Forest Reserve. In 1897, the area was renamed to Mount Rainier Forest Reserve, and the area grew to encompass the entire mountain. In 1899, President McKinley designated Mount Rainier the nation's 5th national park. The area began to see demand for mining and tourism, and the demand for roadways, hotels, and other commercial interests expanded until 1908, when Congress passed legislation to prevent further mining within the park. Commercial use and tourism slowly declined as the park began to uphold the natural processes, but it didn't begin to bounce back until the 1960s. Today, about 2 million people visit the park each year. One of the most difficult and dangerous routes to climb to the summit on Mount Rainier is called Liberty Ridge. Only 53% of those who set out to climb Liberty Ridge route make it to the top. It is remote and it is very steep, and the conditions can change drastically in a very short amount of time. On Friday, May 31st, 2019, 4 climbers, 39, and I'm potentially going to butcher these names. So 39-year-old Yev Krasinski, 33-year-old Ruslan Kasbolatov, 35-year-old Vasily Ashev, and 37-year-old Kostya Toporov began their climb to the summit of Mount Rainier by Liberty Ridge. Yev was no stranger to Mount Rainier and had summited the mountain previously by the Liberty Ridge route. All 4 men had been preparing and planning for this climb for at least 6 months, and while the 4 men all had experience in climbing, Yev was the only one who had lived in the Pacific Northwest, and he was the only one who had experience on Mount Rainier. The other 3 were coming from the East Coast, and Ruslan specifically didn't have high altitude experience, but he was very experienced in ice and rock climbing. Arguably, he was the most experienced in ice climbing out of all 4 of the men. So there is mountaineering, which is also referred to as mountain climbing, and then there is rock climbing, both of which take you to the summit or to a desired location on a mountain, and the skill required to do so intersect quite a bit. And without getting too much into the differences, a lot of the difference depends on where you are in the world and just the general definition of what the activity includes. Mountaineering or mountain climbing is climbing mountains regardless of the means, which is a very broad description. Here in North America, mountaineering could refer to any form of mountain climbing, but usually refers to climbing non-technical peaks, either in expedition style or with a big team, or without technical climbing. Technical climbing tends to fall under the alpinism or rock climbing, which is a term for where there are high levels of either some form of concentration, or you need very, very specific gear or very specific knowledge set to continue forward. Rock climbing is also done usually in a single push with a very small number of team members, and like I said already, the equipment is very specific, and it is mostly in a sheer vertical fashion. So the 4 men started at White River Campground, where they would then have to hike 3.5 miles or 4.5 kilometers to reach Glacier Basin. They would then have to go up St. Elmo Pass, descend just a bit onto Winthrop Glacier, traverse a ridge called Curtis Ridge, which brings you to Carbon Glacier, and from here at the top of Carbon Glacier is the base of Liberty Ridge. Liberty Ridge begins at 8,000 feet or 2,400 meters of elevation and ends at the 14,410-foot summit, or again, 4,392 meter summit. When they set out, they knew that severe weather was coming, and so they purposefully set out with the intention of being off the mountain by the time the weather rolled in. Their intention was to spend 2 nights on the mountain, the first being considered low camp near the base of Liberty Ridge, and the next day they would climb as quickly as possible to reach what they called Summit Camp, which was actually just below the true summit toward the top of Liberty Ridge. And this would be their second overnight, and then they would descend the following morning, meaning that they intended to go up and come all the way back down within a 3-day span. Unfortunately, that is not what ended up happening. That Friday, they made it into low camp and were excited to climb the next day. Now, they were climbing at odd hours so that the snow would be more stable for them to climb on. So on Saturday, June 1st, they set out at 10 p.m. By 8 a.m. on Sunday, June 2nd, they had reached a location called the Saddle at an elevation of 10,800 feet or 3,300 meters. All of the men were feeling good at this point and decided to keep going. It was at this elevation which they came to a point where they wouldn't be able to turn back after they crossed this, as it gets too dangerous to descend due to rock fall and avalanches. In fact, the week prior, another climber had been killed by rockfall doing that exact thing. At 12,000 feet or 3,700 meters, Rustlin began to feel the effects of altitude sickness. Breaks started getting longer and more frequent, and in an attempt to just keep moving, they asked him to lead so that way they could all move at his pace. The pace, though, was worrisome, as with the day going on, the snow and ice were melting, leading to instability, which led to a higher risk for rockfall, avalanche, and collapsing snow, all of which could send them hurtling down the mountain uncontrollably. But the rest of the group didn't realize how disoriented Rustlin truly was until they got to a section called Black Pyramid, which is a 1,000-foot section or about 335 yards of extremely steep ice and rock. Now, remember, this man who isn't feeling good is the one who is the really good ice and rock climber. So without warning, he begins to climb up the ice, and it took the three others yelling at him for him to remember that he needed to set up a belay rig for safety. And this is a really important part of the process, otherwise you can fall, and if you're not tied together, as many climbers do for safety, you can not only fall to your own death, but you can also pluck the others from the side of the mountain and cause injury or death to them as well. At about 7 p.m., they needed to stop for the night. So they scurried up the left side of the section of snow, and this would take them off of the main route. The location was just under a ice cliff on a section of rocks that was just big enough to accommodate the four men. With them, they only had one freeze-dried meal per person, some energy bars, only enough gas to melt a liter of snow, a shovel, a GPS, a walkie-talkie, and their cell phones. They set up their tent in 40 mile per hour or 64 kilometer per hour winds. But that night, the storm that they were trying to avoid would arrive. One of their tent poles snapped the first night, and they used their packs and rocks to try to more securely weigh down the tent. By morning, they found that when their tent collapsed, Yev's bag had slipped out and fell off the cliff. His bag had the shovel and GPS inside. This meant they now didn't have a way to dig a snow cave or determine their exact location. As the storm hit the mountain, severe winds were blowing through, and on Monday, June 3rd, the group of four felt it necessary to call for a rescue. Winds were already reaching 50 miles per hour or 64 kilometers per hour. Rustlin, who had altitude sickness, was also showing signs of hypothermia, and he was unable to assist in going up or down. Luckily, though, they had cell phone reception just long enough to relay their need for help and their approximate location. But in doing so, they failed to ask how to communicate with rescuers from their walkie-talkie, and after this, cell phone reception would not be gained again. The first thing that Mount Rainier National Park did was close down the Liberty Ridge route, not only because there was a storm, but also because they didn't want to try to be rescuing a group that didn't actually need rescued. At 4 p.m., a Chinook helicopter arrived and located the men, and they were seen signaling that they needed help at 13,500 feet or 4,115 meters in elevation. But the strong winds prevented the helicopter from being able to get close enough to rescue any of them by short haul. For those of you who are new here, short haul is where you would be in a harness or in a lift basket, and a cable is attached to whatever device you are in, and you would essentially hang beneath the helicopter as it flew you to a safer location. But this technique requires some aircraft stability, and the wind was just blowing too hard for the helicopter to hold steady at all so that they could short haul and there was absolutely no way that the helicopter would be able to land. 2 more attempts were made that day, and none of them were successful. That was when it dawned on Yev and his climbing partners that they would need to move in order to be rescued. The cliffside was just too steep for a helicopter to safely get to. Because the rescue crews couldn't reach the men, the decision was made to drop off supplies, but the wind made it too difficult to be dropped accurately, and the supplies ended up 1,500 feet or 500 yards below where the group was. After a couple attempts of climbing down to the supplies, Yev, Kostya, and Vasily gave up and returned to their small cliff. Hunkering down for the night, they propped up their tent as best they could, but that night, icefall would destroy the tent and the men felt they had to move immediately. Moving back up to the main route, they started to climb higher, but with the wind gusting at 60 miles per hour or 97 kilometers per hour, they couldn't move. So they tied themselves in and covered up with their sleeping bags and waited for daybreak, which was over 4 hours away. Just before dawn, a break in the wind occurred, and they started to move up the mountain again as soon as they noticed. Only a few hundred feet up, they found an ice cave and decided to rest there for a while. The cave was large enough for the 4 men to lay down, but once here, they wouldn't leave for another 2 days. On Tuesday, June 4th, a larger Chinook helicopter tried multiple times to reach the men, but again, the storm prevented them from getting close. After 3 attempts, the last one at 1 p.m., this helicopter was also forced to turn around. And as a quick note, I cannot imagine how it feels to be a rescuer and being able to see the people that you're trying to rescue and not be able to do anything to help them. I can only imagine that that's a really terrible feeling. So that night, as the 4 men settled in what remained of their tent, rocks, ice, and snow fell and partially buried them. Kostya was hit in the face with a slab of ice that fell from the mountain, and after this, he momentarily stopped breathing. Vasily and Yev were trying to figure out what had happened and if they needed to start CPR when Kostya suddenly jolted and asked, "Who hit me in the eye?" The relief they felt momentarily broke the tension of their situation, but by morning they found the snow had forced the 4 into an area they reasonably could only fit 2 of themselves in. By Wednesday, June 5th, all 4 men were extremely hungry, very weak, experiencing altitude sickness. Some had early signs of hypothermia, and they were running out of what little supplies they did bring with them. They only had 2 sleeping bags left, so they were rotating the usage so that they could all get a chance to stay warm. Another helicopter arrived from the Air Force's 304th Rescue Squadron, which is the same squadron who responded to the Mount Hood incident that we covered in the 2nd exclusive episode, and this squadron was unable to get close. First, because it was too cloudy and they couldn't see, and then second, because the wind and downdrafts were howling at a sustained 50 miles per hour or 80 kilometers per hour, and this was causing them to have very little control over the aircraft. During this time, all 4 men were now experiencing mental breakdowns and panic attacks. Luckily, though, there was always 1 or 2 of the men in these moments that had a clear and level head and was able to help the others through those really difficult times where giving up seemed to be the best option. On Thursday morning, June 6th, there was a break in the weather and the men were desperate to leave the cave they were in. Ruslan was feeling better and the decision was made to climb to the summit. Their intention now was to get off the mountain. The summit would allow them access to the east side of the mountain, which was the easiest side to climb and descend toward Paradise. At 9:15 a.m., just as the men reached the final section before the summit, so did a helicopter, and it was able to land. They were roughly 600 feet or 200 yards from the summit. It first picked up 2 men and then came back for the other 2. Where they were picked up from was roughly a half mile from where they were spotted the days prior, and it is noted that the route to get from one location to the other is extremely difficult and requires expert-level technical climbing skills. So this tells you exactly how hard these 4 men had to work to get from one point to another in the conditions that they were in. Upon arrival at Harborview Medical Center, all 4 men were in good condition despite the clear, long exposure and frostbite they experienced. A couple were dehydrated and had scrapes and bruises from the falling ice. They were all able to be released from the hospital the same day. The Mount Rainier National Park had 33 people involved in the 5-day rescue attempt and had contingency plans in place if they were unable to reach the men with the helicopter. One of those plans included climbers would be deployed on Thursday if the helicopter was unsuccessful. And I want to end this with a few safety lessons that can be learned from this because selfishly, I really want to climb Mount Rainier someday. And I also think that these are just really important things to be mindful of, no matter if you're just going exploring or if you're climbing a mountain. First, mountaineers are amateur weather forecasters, and it's best to pull weather from all of the local sources rather than just one or two. And 1A, never take a chance when the good weather window is small. Second, like with many things, it's better to predict that something will take you longer than you might think, because if things go wrong, this then allows you to have some extra time to figure out what to do. This also means that because you're planning for it to take longer, you will bring extra food and gas that might be useful in making fire, having some heat, melting water, cooking food, and the like. And then last, if you can't help yourself, help your rescuers. Move to an area that is easily accessible. Know where you are, have a GPS, and have a way to communicate with your rescuers. And also know how to use these items. Don't just buy them and have them on you. Take the time to learn how to use them. Technology is so cool in what it is capable of, and at this point in time, we really have no excuse not to have something with us and to not know how to use it. That is all for this week. Thank you so much for listening and bearing with me as I do my best to get you these episodes in this very busy season that I'm in this summer. And stay tuned for the exclusive episode coming out Friday, and I will have the next solo episode to you next week. Thank you for listening. Please take a moment to rate and subscribe from wherever you listen to Tragedy with a View. To get access to ad-free episodes, bonus content, and more, please join us on our Patreon. The link will be in the show notes. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram and Facebook, and to share a story of your own, send us a Campfire Confessional email at tragedywithaview@gmail.com. We'll see you next time.